Hi there, class. I'm standing in the gallery at the Museum of Science that used to be known as the New England Life Zones. It's one of the older galleries in the museum, and it contains collections from the original Boston Society of Natural History, the parent of the Museum of Science, before it moved over here to become a science museum on the dam on Charles River. The gallery looks nothing like it did at that point. I want you to imagine basically an empty hall with the dioramas and nothing in front of them, nothing around except maybe a bench in the center of the gallery. Now, the New England Life Zones was intended to show people not only the different zones around New England and the creatures contextualized in their setting, they also wanted people to understand that the creatures, whether they were birds or animals, were actually well adapted to their setting. But when they did a front-end evaluation or an evaluation about this gallery, they found that only 19% of the people actually could name an adaptation if they went through it. And frankly, the gallery was mostly used as a place for mothers with toddlers. The mothers would sit in the center and chat, and the toddlers could wander freely because it was an enclosed space. Well, in the late 80s, just as the government was working on hashing out the ADA public law, which was written actually in 1990, in the late 80s, one of the content developers by the name of Betty Davidson, scientist and content developer who actually was a person who had a handicap, took an audit of all the exhibits in the museum and said this was the worst because everything was behind glass and it wasn't approachable or accessible by people who couldn't see, etc. So she got a grant from the Science Foundation to actually rehab this exhibit to consider people who couldn't access the material behind the glass. And that included the small, tiny labels that were 8.5 by 11 that had a lot of jargon and technical language to them, and so they decided to redo the entire gallery. And they included a lot of testing. They brought in the Perkins School for the Blind, they brought in a number of other people, and they had an advisory council made up of people with disabilities, and they came up with a scenario where they adapted things in front of each of the dioramas that were more tactile. For example, for those who couldn't read, there was a hearphone. For those who couldn't read the lettering, whether they were low vision or didn't speak English very well or read English very well. And there's some sort of either scent box or tactile, and then there were buttons. Everything that you see that has been added on was evaluated very well, down to the lettering and the size of the button shapes and how they were placed in front of each one. Now, this has gone through several iterations, as most museums have. The original rehab was in 1989, and of course this is 2017. So what we're looking at now is a lot of things that are added on, such as the large introductory label, Windows into the Natural World. You'll also see a high contrast, much larger font. And as we go around the exhibit, I want you to notice how things have actually been changed to make the objects in the diorama more accessible to a broad audience. Now, when they did summit evaluation with their first iteration of renovations, they found out that 100% of the visitors who went through this gallery could name an animal adaptation based upon everything they added in. So it was a success, but what it was a turning point for the museum, because they learned that it was not just making it accessible for people who couldn't see or couldn't hear or whatever. It was made multi-sensory and therefore was broadly accessible and used by lots of people. Lots of people used the hearphones, lots of people used the scent boxes, and it became a very popular part of the gallery. So I think we're going to look at a few of the adaptations in front of the cases and then talk about the interactives that are in the exhibit. So I wanted to show you an example of the rehabilitation of one of the dioramas. The dioramas themselves are quite magnificent, and considering the age of the specimens, they've been very well conserved. But because of the way they were conserved, they have to be kept behind glass because of the materials used. So I wanted to show you one of the adaptations that was added to enhance the experience for people who can't access the material behind glass. So you'll see that this is angled. It's at a nice height for people of any age. It has an indent, so if you're in a wheelchair, you can pull up to it. It has an audio text label for those who can't read or may not have English as a first language, and this is always standardized on a square button throughout the museum. And so you can pick the earphone up and listen to it just like you would a telephone, and it would visually describe exactly what's inside the diorama.
It is a June afternoon at Squam Lake in New Hampshire. These white-tailed deer, a doe and her 2 fawns, have come to drink.
The other thing they have here is a mounted set of antlers, which people can touch, and they get a much better sense of what the animal is like because they're actually touching something. And on the other end, there's actually, I believe, a scent box, which you can push and then smell something that relates to the environment and relates to the deer. So it's a multisensory approach, and it was sort of a breakthrough because they thought we were just doing this for blind people. We were just doing this for people who couldn't see the objects behind the glass. But it turned out that everybody loved it so much, and they found out that even people had preferences in their learning, so maybe one child would come with a family and smell all the smells, and then one child would go and feel all the tactiles, and then they would get back together and discuss what they had learned about the dioramas. I want to point out one of the set of interactive stations, and I mean by interactive, people actually have to do something to understand it. And this was prototyped again with handicapped people, blind people. The height is standardized for people with wheelchairs to pull through. Again, there's an audio label always at the left with the same square button. But what this does is it has resin models of various animal parts, and it makes a visual metaphor between natural objects that people would be familiar with and the part of the animal. So here you have a bird that would be in the water with webbed feet, and that acts like the scuba diver's fin. Here you have the talons of an eagle or a raptor, and that's kind of like the hook that you can feel for grabbing, how good they are at grabbing. The long, narrow beak of the birds that tend to grope for worms or grubs or things in the sand have very similar to the pliers you might have in your house. And again, the chisel teeth of the beaver is very similar to the chisel here. And finally, the claws of a bear, which stick out, is very much like your cultivator, and that's why you can often see the scratches of the bear marks. So this works very well because not only can a person feel the durable images, but they also can get the idea of what they do based upon the visual metaphor. Now this interactive is actually also tactile. Again, it's built for people so they can access it by a wheelchair. Again, the audio text is always in the same spot. And this is one about, is it fur or isn't? What's real fur and what's fake fur? So they give you examples of actual samples of fur. Very soft beaver fur, which is why it was used for coats many years ago. The coarse fur of the deer, and the long, soft fur of a bear. And they also have sort of updates of things that you can look at magnified so that you can see better the texture of the different types of fur. So again, this is a more tactile way that if you see the deer, you say, well, now I know what a deer feels like. I felt the antlers, now I feel the fur. So again, it's another added layer of information that allows people to access what's literally behind glass. Making Models is the last Science Center exhibit where science process was explored. And that way that people visiting were asked to do things that scientists do. And in this case, it was making models. But they wanted to show the extent of how everybody uses models, whether it's symbols or music or whatever, to understand our world, as well as how scientists use models. So you'll see a variety of things here, from a giant model of a grasshopper to a tiny model of a locomotive, and other things that represent models that you might be more familiar with in daily life. The exhibit itself was the first one to incorporate universal design from the get-go. So when we go in and look at the overall exhibit, you'll see that there's codified ways of where the audio labels are, there's a lot of tactiles, and there's enough things that are expressed in different ways that a person who has a preference can get the idea of what a model means and what a model is just by going through various parts of the exhibit. I wanted to show you just one of the examples of how universal design is incorporated into one part of this exhibit, and this is a module called Which Model is Best? And it gives you all sorts of things that are models that can be touched, some can't be touched. There's a stuffed duck here, there's a sort of a resin model here, there's a little rubber ducky at the end, and there's, of course, as I said, there's always audio text. These are what we call hearphones. They're very comfortable to hold and they're very lightweight as opposed to the other style phone. And so anybody who wants to have the instructions read to them can press the button and listen to the hearphone. So basically what this is a very low-tech interactive, and it's an important thing to understand that you don't necessarily have to use high-tech to make things accessible. So these use what are called as flipboards or flappers, where the idea is decoy. Who might use this model? Lift to see some ideas. So you can lift it and it says perhaps a hunter or a photographer, as well as a button underneath.
Might be used by a hunter or a photographer. Who else might use this model?
And it goes through a plush duck. Who might use this model? You pick it up and you can either read it or you can press the button.
A plush duck might be used by a child or someone learning duck sounds. Who else might use this model?
And so on. And there's also this. Give you the actual sound of the duck. Who might use the duck call? And of course a hunter or a photographer again. And again, if you want to have the audio, you can press the button. Everything is accessible, everything is created at an angle, even the top reach. I'm sitting in the chair, but if I were in a wheelchair, this would also be representative of what I could reach within this. I might have to move to access the rest of the table, but this is all completely universally designed. Probably the most favorite interactive that's in this exhibit is Can You Make a Model? And they figured out a way of doing this they used a simple thing. First they used pipe cleaners as a prototype, but pipe cleaners were messy. So what they came up with is this is a magnetized board that you see, and they have different colors of bead chain. The bead chain doesn't have any endings, so you can't make a bracelet out of it, so it's no use for anyone to take, but it can stick to things. So if you wanted to make a model, I want something like a flower. So very crude, but you can get the idea, and what happens is it really translates into something that a child can understand as a model of something. So this is actually good for all ages, and it's also one of the ones that encourages social participation because there's multiple stations and families could sit down and work together, so that keeps that social unit that's very important into understanding how people learn in museums. I want to use this opportunity to discuss the exercise and follow-up assignment that's related to universal design. And the exercise I'd like to have you do is in a museum, and you're going to need a partner, a friend, spouse, or somebody to go with you. It's kind of nice if you can go to a museum that has interactives because it challenges you more on how to describe things. And this whole thing is about understanding how to describe to someone who cannot see an object or an interactive. So I have my student here, Courtney, and I am going to lead her to an exhibit. Now she can't see, so she's going to close her eyes. Now the way you lead a person who is not sighted is, first of all, you ask them if they mind being led. Yeah, go for it. Okay. And then what you do is you bend your arm and offer it their elbow, and they will grab around the elbow, like that. And the reason for that is if I turn this way, she can sense it. If I'm turning slightly the other way, she can sense it. If I come to a door, I put my arm behind me, she goes behind me. It's a very easy way. You don't want to grab onto someone who can't see and push them forward. You want to give them cues, and this is the easiest way to do it. So I'm going to lead her over to an interactive, and I'm going to do the exercise. This is an interactive. It's a round sort of shape, cylinder shape. It's mauve in color, and it has a label on the front side of it, Mystery Scene. It says, reach your hand into the holes and feel parts of the diorama. As you put the clues together, let me finish explaining, create a mental image of what the diorama, and there's a diorama actually behind this that you will go and find out what's actually there from the clues. So on the bottom of this cylinder, about waist height or a little lower, there's some open diaphragms that you can go in and you can feel each clue. So reach your hand in and feel it and try to figure out what it is.
It's like a rope with a hook on it.
Okay, so now we'll move to the next clue. So we go over. You can also smell from that. Yeah.
Handle on a pipe. Tube.
Okay, now we'll go to the third clue. There's no scent box, there just is a reach-in area.
There's a sphere with two raised lines on it.
Okay, then we go on to the fourth.
It's like a little stick. Half of it feels braided or ribbed. Oh, that's the next one.
Okay, now we'll go to the last and fifth clue.
It's textured like a brick.
Okay, can you put anything together that these all might have in common?
Maybe construction?
Okay, well, let's walk into the diorama area. And you're going to have a hearphone, and then you can hear what's described.
Sitting on the weathered wooden boards at the bottom of the scene are the worker's tools and personal items, such as his large coffee thermos, helmet, tools, and bricks.
And for the benefit of the students watching, creating models of things we can't see, this is a building site, and it, as she correctly said, it had materials related to construction. But she used her tactile senses to figure that out, and even though she can't particularly see what's inside the diorama, she understands what she has done. So that's what you're going to do as a student. You're going to lead somebody that is not going to be sighted. And this is not sympathies for the sighted and not sighted. This is not an empathy exercise. This exercise is to test your descriptive powers of making sure that you can understand how to prioritize instructions to a person who can't see what they're doing. The other part of this exercise is that you're going to switch with your partner. Your partner then will pick out something that they will guide you to, and they will do the same thing. So you have the experience of being described to. And once you've done that, I'd like you to write up a short paper about what your experience was being the person who led the blind person and being the person described to. Did things meet your expectations? Were you surprised? Did you kind of see in your mind what you expected to see? So that's the actual exercise. And then the follow-up is to go to a museum and find something that has nothing to do with universal design. It has nothing, it's behind glass, it's in a case, and try to retrofit that so it's universally designed by adding either sounds or smells or tactiles, all the sorts of things that we've kind of pointed out here that would enhance the experience for a visitor who can't just access things. If you want to do an audio label, you should do an audio label that's no more than 2 minutes, and you make sure if you're describing a painting, you're describing a painting and not interpreting the painting. In other words, you're the eyes of the person, not the brain. So that's your exercise, and I will be going over it in class when we talk about ADA, just to review.